Okay, so as part of the coasts unit, you're required to learn a case study of a coastal habitat, and for that coastal habitat you will need to be able to describe the types of flora and fauna, so the plants and animals that live there, and the characteristics, the reasons you find those types of flora and fauna there. You'll be asked possibly to discuss some of the problems and the threats to that coastal habitat, and then you'll have to talk about some of the conservation methods that have been put in place to manage that habitat sustainably. So the case study that we've learnt to describe this is Keyhaven, and specifically the salt marsh that is found at Keyhaven. Okay, and this is found in Hampshire on the south coast of England. Okay, so that's on the very southerly coast of England. Okay, Keyhaven Saltmarsh. Now it's important to remember that the salt marsh at Keyhaven is actually found on a spit. So let's just talk about that as a bit of a revision as well. So in terms of the south coast of England, we know that the prevailing wind comes from a south-westerly direction. So the wind hits that coastline, the swash pushes material up the beach at an angle, but then gravity brings that material through the backwash at 90 degrees. So what that leads to is the zigzag motion of material along the beach. So longshore drift operates in a west to easterly direction. Okay, so material is moved along this coastline, and where the coast changes direction, the material continues to be deposited into the sea, so you get the growth of this long piece of sand out into the ocean. Now what we also know is that usually you get a secondary wind coming from a different direction, in this case from the southeast. It's not as strong, but it does lead to a curved ending to your spit. Okay, so all along this spit you've got Hurst Beach, which I'm just going to indicate here like this, and that is Hurst Beach and Spit. Okay, so I'm just going to label that there, Hurst Beach and Spit. Okay, now where this spit extends out into the ocean, you actually get a sheltered area behind the spit, and because it's sheltered, material starts to be deposited, but also material is blown from the mainland, okay, into the ocean, and because it's sheltered it doesn't get removed, so that's where you get the development of this salt marsh area. So I'm just going to indicate the salt marsh area, okay, in the sheltered area behind the spit. Now on an OS map that salt marsh would probably be indicated with this symbol done in blue, so we'll just put that on there to remind ourselves of that. So that's where our salt marsh is developing. So let's now think about, well, what actually does salt marsh look like in terms of the plants and animals, or the flora and fauna that would develop. So let's think about what salt marsh is like. Well, it's very boggy, very wet land that would sometimes be flooded with seawater, so seawater would come onto this, leading to it be very wet. We also know that salt water would obviously go on it. So if we can indicate that on this cross section, so the ocean at high tide, the sea, would come in on the salt marsh and would actually submerge the land. Okay, so at the very start here you would get plants that would be covered by the sea at certain times, so they would have to be resistant to seawater and very able to live there. Okay, so we call these first ones the pioneer plants. They're the ones that start our succession that I'll talk about in a minute. Now I've just told you that these plants are resistant to salt water, they're able to grow there, and that's what we call halophytes, plants that are able to grow and be resistant to salt water. Now examples are cordgrass, we would find cordgrass here, and also marram grass. So as well as being resistant to salt water, they're halophytes. They also have very long root systems, and these roots are able to go and find any fresh water that is deep within the ground, but it also stabilizes the plant because very near to the shore the wind is very strong and can actually blow these plants over. So these long root systems help to anchor those plants and stop them from blowing away. Now a little bit further inland, okay, we find some slightly different plants such as sea lavenders. So these tend to be more bushy, larger plants, so we get things like sea lavender and sea asters, more shrub-like. Okay, again they would have deep root systems to hold them in place and stop them blowing over by the wind. Now the reason that you start to get these more developed plants a little bit further in is because of the root systems that hold them in place, but also the fact that as you move inland, it's important to remember that two things are happening. Well, the first thing is that soil fertility is increasing, so the soil is getting healthier as you go in. Now a reason for that is because as you get more plants will die and put organic material into the sand, making the soil quality better, so more things can grow. Now the reason that more things can grow, returning organic matter into the soil, is because the soil gets less salty as you move away from the ocean. Okay, so we call that reduced salinity. There's less salt in that sand, and so more variety of plants can grow. Now as reduced salinity and soil fertility increases, we know that organic matter increases, allowing more plants to grow. Now the further inland you go, the more variety of plants that will grow, and here we get our climax vegetation. Okay, so this is called a plant succession, and here we get our climax in vegetation, and here you will find trees such as oak and lots more developed shrubs, and the vegetation will be a lot denser. So that's what we call our vegetation succession as we move inland away from the sea. Okay, now this salt marsh is under threat. It actually has a lot of problems facing it. One of the things obviously is that you're next to the ocean, and so you're very susceptible, you're very at risk from storms, and indeed up to 6 meters of salt marsh can be lost a year. In particular, the 1989 storm was particularly bad, removing a huge amount of salt marsh. Another threat to the salt marsh area is actually that animals can graze on this land. There's my animal. Okay, and obviously by eating the vegetation they will reduce the vegetation, which stabilizes the salt marsh and holds it together, so it makes it much more likely to be removed. And also they will trample on plants and erode it through the animals' feet. Perhaps the biggest threat to the salt marsh is tourism. I've already spoken about here the beach, and that will attract tourists, but also at the end here you've got Hurst Castle. Now Hurst Castle was a defensive castle built hundreds of years ago to defend the coast, and that's now become a really big tourist attraction. Upwards of 40,000 tourists can visit that place each year. Now obviously with tourists you get litter, you get trampling of the vegetation as they walk up and down the beach and perhaps stray onto the salt marsh, eroding and damaging, scaring wildlife, perhaps during nesting times for birds, which is a critical time. So tourism is perhaps the biggest threat that the Keyhaven salt marshes get. Now what can we do, or indeed what are we doing to manage and protect that area in a sustainable way? Well, perhaps the most important is the fact that the area has been designated a site of special scientific interest. Now, that means that it is heavily protected. There are park wardens who visit there regularly. You're very restricted in what you can do. You can't remove any animals from there or any plants. You can't build on there. It's really protected very closely. So that's perhaps the biggest thing that's happening. It's also a national nature reserve. And again, as I said, that would lead to there being a park ranger who goes and checks on the quality of the environment and makes sure that everything is in order. This site here, Hurst Castle, is actually an English heritage site, and so part of the tourist exhibit will actually be to educate people about the surrounding environment, to tell people to stay to paths, to provide bins, and hopefully through that education lead to there being less destruction of that environment. They've also invested in rock armour, rock armour here along the spit to try and reduce the impact of storm events, especially in light of the 1989 storm. And in fact, in 1996 they also went through a program of beach nourishment. That's where they're replacing sand onto the beach, because that beach provides a natural barrier that dissipates the energy of the waves, so protecting the salt marsh. And that actually cost £5 million to do, so a significant investment. Now, one of the reasons they needed to do that is that further up the coast they have actually built groins here. Now, they've built groins to trap sediment to hold these beaches in place for the tourists. So they wanted to maintain these beaches here because tourism brought such economic benefit to the area. But one of the effects of that is it starves and stops sediment from moving down the coast, so adding to the beach here and providing that natural barrier. So they've had to nourish these beaches by man, by actually physically bringing in sand to replace that natural barrier. So that's the Keyhaven Saltmarsh in Hampshire on the south coast.